Welcome to the Versus History podcast with your hosts, Patrick O'Shaughnessy, Connell Smith and Elliot Watson.
Hello and welcome to Versus History. My name is Dr. Elliot L. Watson, and around the microphone as always, Connell Smith and Patrick O'Shaughnessy. How are we, chaps?
Very well, always, but just not recently, I guess, is the...
It's been a while.
Not for me.
No, not
for
you.
me. It's great to have you two back. Good to see you. I mean, I see you every day in our place of work. But
whether you want to or not.
Absolutely. It's good to see you still in our place of work, interestingly enough. We're just talking about some disciplinary and substantive history, our favourite thing in the world.
Yeah, now you have been hard at it, Pat, in terms of the podcasts, interviewing all and sundry about their books, historians, etc. How are you finding that?
It's great. We're now, gentlemen, nearing our 150th birthday, which is exciting in podcast terms. Podcast years are a bit like cat or dog years, I guess. So for any podcast to get beyond 100 is pretty important. And to be nearing your 150th episode is just testament to the great work that you guys have done. So
when you said 150th birthday, I thought, maybe I've missed something, but you're looking pretty old, not 150 years.
Still be working at 150, that would deserve a big pat on the back. But versus history, strength to strength, right? And there's some things we'll talk about at the end as we move towards summer 2022 for us to be excited about, and all the listeners as well, stuff they can get involved in and potentially win for nothing.
There's not the only 150th, the FA Cup final, wasn't it? The 150th running? No, that's a horse racing term. I saw them all holding up shirts.
Iteration.
Iteration.
So it was the 150th anniversary of
I believe
the FA Cup.
So. Yeah.
Ah, well, there you go.
There were lots of old footballers holding up shirts saying 150, and I half heard the commentary.
Maybe they were just Versus History fans.
Maybe they were. I'm guessing they weren't 150.
No.
But it was a decent outcome. It went all the way to penalties, and that was probably the most exciting part of the match. Just for the historical and public record.
Why not? Yeah. Okay, so today we are gathered around the microphone for a very specific topic. Now, it is a topic that was suggested to me by a friend of mine yesterday or the day before, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. But I just want to talk briefly about why initially this topic is of interest to me. The topic of the question really is the central question is Ranil Sri Lanka's Churchill? Now, for those of you who don't know who that is, you're going to find out. For those of you who don't know Churchill is, you're going to find out as well. Now, the reason this is of interest to me is because this part of our discussion is related to Sri Lanka, at least a small part of it. And I lived there for 13 years. My wife is British Sri Lankan. Her parents are Sri Lankan. I have a great affinity for the country. And as a result, it seems because it is in the news at the moment and terrible things are happening there, it's worthy of discussion. But in order for us to at least address this statement, is Ranil Sri Lanka's Churchill, I need to give us all a little bit of a background. Chaps, is that okay?
Absolutely.
Please do.
Quite possibly needed in my case.
Okay, so let's go. On the 12th of May, so that was, 3 days ago, the president of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapakse, asked a career politician, Ranil Wickremesinghe of the UNP, or United National Party, to take up the position of Prime Minister. Now, this will be the 6th time that Ranil has been the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. But none of his previous 5 tenures started with Sri Lanka and all of her people facing such an island-wide catastrophe, a virtual breakdown of its entire economic infrastructure. Nor did any of Ranil's previous tenures as PM start without an election, which this one did. After he accepted the Prime Minister's position from the President, Gotabaya Rajapakse, Ranil was asked a rather snarky question by a British journalist, asking why he thought he had the authority to run the country when he had not been given an election mandate to do so. His reply, which I'm paraphrasing now, was that in 1940, Winston Churchill was selected to run the UK as Prime Minister without an election after Clement Attlee resigned in the face of mounting pressure during World War II. Ranil went on to say that, again I'm paraphrasing, in times of national disaster, the right person shouldn't need an election in order to lead a country back to the light. To this point we will return. as this is the question we want to address in the podcast. But in order for our listeners who are not necessarily Sri Lankan to understand exactly the context that we are going to place ourselves in, I need to just give a little bit of background, if that's okay, guys.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the current president is a man called Gotabaya Rajapakse. Okay, he is from a political party known as the Sri Lankan People's Front. He has a brother, and his brother Mahinda Rajapakse became president in 2005. Gotabaya, under him, was appointed the defense minister. Now, at the time they were president and defense minister, there was a war raging in Sri Lanka between the government forces and the LTTE, or the Liberation Tamil Tigers of Elam. This war had been essentially going on for 40, 50 years, but these brothers were able to bring it to a conclusion. A bloody one, but they brought it to a conclusion. And as a result of this, they had this political capital from a large portion of the electorate of Sri Lanka. They were seen by many as heroes for bringing this war to a conclusion. Now, 2015, Mahinda Rajapakse, the president, was dumped out of office surprisingly after a snap election. Okay, now let's jump forward to 2019. Gotabaya, who was in America, he'd left and gone to America to reside, he comes back from the US and he contests the presidential elections, which he wins in 2019. His party, the SLPP, the Sri Lankan People's Front, also wins massively in Parliament. Now, as a result of this, Gotabaya, the president, is able to usher through the Parliament something called the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, what this did was it essentially centralised presidential authority and sidelined certain powers of the Prime Minister and the Parliament. This allowed Gotabaya to appoint people to governmental positions without, crucially, the approval of Parliament. He appointed his brother as Prime Minister and other relatives in cabinet positions. Accusations of nepotism and vast corruption have plagued the Rajapakse family since they entered politics, but their tight control and apparently bloody and brutal reprisals on critics, not to mention the political capital they gained from winning the war in 2009, helped them become almost untouchable. However, if our listeners have been paying attention to the news recently, they know that Sri Lanka has been in a catastrophic economic freefall, and the Rajapakse family have borne the brunt of the massive public outcry. The Sri Lankan rupee has collapsed against the pound and the dollar. Consumer prices have surged 30% since last year. Oil and gas imports that Sri Lanka is wholly dependent upon for energy, transportation, cooking and such have ground to a halt because the government has burned through almost all of its foreign currency reserves. Island-wide power cuts lasting 8 hours and longer, massive queues for petrol, oil and food have led to deaths and massive protests across the country, forcing the previously untouchable Mahinda Rajapakse to resign as Prime Minister and actually flee into hiding in an east naval base, or rather a naval base in the east of the island called Trincomalee. There are arguments that COVID, the 2019 bombings and a lack of the economic lifeblood of Lanka, tourism, have helped lead to this catastrophic situation. However, the vast majority of people blame the Rajapakse family for economic mismanagement and the wholesale plundering of Sri Lanka's coffers. Hence the rallying cry, Gota, go home, actually imploring Gotabaya Rajapakse to go back to where they think he actually lives, which is the United States. Now, all of this brings us back to Ranil Wickremesinghe, the new but unelected Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. First of all, now this is where we'll open it up, and I apologise for that, but I think it's important that we've had that bit of background. Is Ranil's comparison a valid one? Bearing in mind he is, as yet, the only UNP politician in the cabinet, and most of the other political parties have refused to be part of the cabinet. Is the comparison between what he is facing and what Churchill faced, the two contexts, is it a valid comparison? Pat, I'm going to ask you.
Well, it's a valid question to ask, but my answer is no. Connell, I'd love to hear from you first. You are the scholar, you tell us what you think.
He looks
You tell us.
surprised.
The question, I think, is a valid one because it's interesting, right? But I don't think the answer is yes. It's no. For me, I'll tell you what
I think the key is to work out with any, I guess, the issue that we have here is we're making historical comparisons, and when we're doing that, we have to always understand that history does not repeat itself in exactly the same way ever. The people are always different, the location is always different, and therefore when we are making comparisons, we are essentially making judgments on similarity and degree of similarity where there is always going to be ambiguity. It's never going to be exactly the same, but also it's never going to be completely different because people are involved and there are motivations or all sorts of different things. So we're always on a spectrum. So I guess that brings us then to the process by which I think we should make historical comparisons, which is to draw out specific elements of the situation, see, well, is that element repeated? Okay, is that element repeated? And therefore we manage to incrementally perhaps build up a picture of repeatability or comparability. So I guess the question is, what are the key elements of Ranil's situation that we can draw some parallels with the Churchill? So you started from the position that we've got an unelected Prime Minister. That's very clearly something that is a parallel to Churchill's situation in 1940. Yeah. So in 1940, for our listeners who aren't aware, Britain is in the Second World War. The Nazis have launched an occupation, invading Norway. The Prime Minister at the time is a guy called Neville Chamberlain, who was elected, who's been in power through the run-up to the war, but comes under political attack for, I guess, for a number of reasons, but ultimately, as I understand it, boiling down to not successfully prosecuting the war up until that point, perhaps underestimating the intentions of Hitler in some ways. And that brings us to a political situation where there are those who wish to remove him, and he is defeated in a vote of no confidence in early May 1940, which then creates a situation where a new Prime Minister is needed.
So how then, Pat, do we end up with a Prime Minister of Great Britain being selected when there isn't an election? So Neville Chamberlain has lost the confidence of the Parliament and of his own party, the Conservative Party. What happens next, Pat?
Right, I think we have to look at the political system of England, Great Britain at the time. You're not voting for a Prime Minister. You vote to return an MP from your constituency to Parliament. The role of choosing Prime Minister, that is at the behest of the reigning monarch at the time. So we need to understand there are some clear distinctions here. The King or Queen at the time has the right to invite consultation with the Privy Council, the leader of the largest party, to become Prime Minister and form a government. There's two parts there.
Yeah.
It's the monarch's prerogative to do that, which is completely constitutional and completely in keeping with precedent. There's nothing unconstitutional about that whatsoever. The difficult thing there is the proof is in the pudding. It's about forming a government and making it stick, which ultimately Churchill was able to do. He'd been sort of in the wilderness for 10 years. I'll get back to some of the historiographical views of Churchill in a second. But ultimately, that is how Prime Ministers are made in the UK or Britain. You're invited by the monarch to form a government. You've got to accept, and you've got to try and do the really, really tough bit, which is form that government, which you did.
Which actually, if you look at the most recent appointment of Prime Ministers in Britain, actually 3 of the last 4 have been first appointed Prime Minister not off the back of an election victory. So Boris Johnson, 2019, upon the resignation of Theresa May.
Yeah.
Theresa May in 2016 on the resignation of David Cameron. Both of those have subsequently won elections, but as Patrick says, are you elected Prime Minister? But also going back, so then you have David Cameron, who took over as Prime Minister, having won an election as being in opposition. But then Gordon Brown, even before that, back in 2007, he took over from Tony Blair, just by virtue of the leadership of the party changing, then becoming Prime Minister.
So we've got comparisons.
We've got comparisons to Churchill, and also a relatively seemingly commonplace comparison, particularly if you look at drawing comparisons with other British leaders who first come to the Prime Ministership
Absolutely, because the fundamental thing we're saying here is the monarch is the head of state, and it's their prerogative to choose who they want, from the House of Commons, Palace of Westminster, House of Lords, to form a government.
Which I guess bringing it to the Sri Lanka situation, if the president, Gotabaya Rajapakse, is in that similar position to the monarch, we have got that parallel.
Yeah, I think the constitution of Sri Lanka does give the president that power, but that power has essentially one that does not need the consultation of the parliament. That is a very recent development, the 20th amendment to the constitution of 2019. Now, Gotabaya was able to get that through because he had the parliamentary support after winning the local elections. But it was very controversial because it was seen as a way for the president, Gotabaya, to centralise authority and essentially override the constitution. Very, very controversial. Having said that, it is now enshrined in the constitution. It can be changed. But in that sense, the president, just like the monarch, does have the constitutional power to select the prime minister. So
Absolutely.
there is a comparison there.
Yeah, so it sounds like we've got a couple of points of comparison there. Kind of the process being a constitutional normality, I guess, or kind of abiding by the constitution, and we've got the lack of an election. I think there's perhaps some other elements of the comparison maybe that we'd want to.
There is. Can I just interject and say it may seem like this is proroguing Parliament or the monarch potentially acting outside the jurisdiction of their powers, but it's ultimately not, and that's because of maths, my friends. If you're invited to form a government, you've then got to actually make it stick in Parliament, and straight away, if you don't have the maths behind you, you have nothing behind you. And the
when you say maths, you mean the majority of
essentially
support
you're
in the
going to, exactly that. You're going to need to be able to chaperone through both houses legislation. So if you can't do that, what you will find is the monarch inviting somebody else to form a government.
That's a good segue into the next part. Churchill was able to make that stick by forming a national government. Right now, the situation in Sri Lanka is that we just don't know what's going to happen, because you have Ranil Wickremesinghe is a career politician. Some people like him, some people don't like him. Some people think that he is perhaps the man, cometh the hour. Some people think that actually Ranil Wickremesinghe doesn't really have the support of other parties, and that maybe he's some kind of night watchman that is going to be a placeholder prime minister until the dominant political party at the minute, which is Gotabaya's political party, the Sri Lankan People's Front, until they get back into some kind of position of parliamentary authority, cabinet authority, at which point they'll just usher him back out and the Rajapakses will coalesce again. So right now, that comparison is not a valid one. Churchill was able to form a national government that stuck. Right now, we don't know what's going to happen. The majority of, or it would appear that the other political parties in Sri Lanka are really unsure as to whether they're going to support this move.
Okay, I had some historiographical stuff to say about Churchill, but I can hold that.
No, let's move straight onto that.
Okay, then. So, looking at the historiography as I always do, I mean that's versus history's raison d'etre, right? Base it on history. So, to move it beyond the anecdote, I've got a little pre-prepared speech here, but bear with me. Okay, so to adopt this sort of Churchill had no parliamentary support narrative, or Churchill was the man of the hour, is really to wittingly or unwittingly endorse an intentionalist and probably teleological standpoint, which Churchill himself would no doubt have fetished as a sort of self-claimed, preordained man of destiny. Now, I'm sure we're all aware that the Britain stood alone myth of the 1940s, Britain against the Nazis, back to the wall, that's largely been debunked because it's patently untrue. Britain could draw on the reserves of the huge empire which it did. So that's gone. However, this Churchill alone myth of the 1930s and 40s, sort of the lone man in Parliament, is often swallowed wholesale by his supporters and occasionally and unintentionally by his detractors. Now, what I mean by that is Churchill himself said when he was given the role or offered the role by the monarch, and I repeat, I felt as if I were walking with destiny and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. Now, really, Churchill, to my mind, whilst he did think of himself in this sort of grandiose terms, he was little more than a faux demeure. If you look at the structure and the conditions in Britain in the 1930s, it was really bleak, as we all know, with the Jarrow March, Great Depression, and a history of national government anyway. Now, Churchill had huge parliamentary provenance. He'd been in Parliament since 1900. So he was 40. He'd been in Parliament 40 years. I mean, I'm just 39 now, so he's been in, and I'm old. He's been in Parliament longer than I've been alive. So if we're looking at provenance and longevity as a sort of qualification for being a Prime Minister, which it usually is, he had that going for him. Appeasement had failed, I know we'll touch on this soon, which Chamberlain, the pre-existing PM, had approved. Churchill had a track record of opposing that. There really was, my friends, a lack of a credible alternative figure, especially those who had stood against appeasement as Churchill had. The only person really in the running for this role was Lord Halifax.
Yeah.
Now, he would have had to be Prime Minister from the House of Lords. And Halifax was completely reluctant to play that role. To read, therefore, Churchill's rise to the position of Prime Minister, due to him sort of devouring politically Halifax, is to adopt a really anachronistic viewpoint that to be PM was possible from the House of Lords, as Halifax himself states. And also Halifax's sort of humble reluctance to. He said himself in 1940, Lord Halifax, he emphasised this, the difficult position of Prime Minister, unable to make contact with the centre of gravity in the House of Commons. And he was true, there hadn't been a PM in the House of Lords since the turn of the century. He really knew that it wouldn't be possible from where he sat. And finally he said himself, Winston was a better choice, I quote.
Halifax
said that. So, I mean, quite humble. I mean, it may well have turned out, and I'm sure many people agree that Winston was a pretty phenomenal choice in terms of helping navigate Britain to victory. But if we endorse this sort of idea that Churchill came from nowhere, overturned all the odds, it's teleological tosh, the likes of which, although I must say I read the biography from Boris Johnson, it wasn't bad. I mean, he would have us believe, give you a quote, and he's from Johnson in his biography, he says, he, Churchill, is a resounding human rebuttal to all Marxist historians who think history is the story of vast and impersonal economic forces. The point of the Churchill factor is that one man can make all the difference. Now, the extent to which he did during the war is obviously up for debate. Max Hastings thinks that after 41 he was less of a positive aspect than he had been hitherto.
And of course, he also had the assistance of the Americans that had then come into the war. So
absolutely. And I'll just sort of curtail it by saying, this is from Richard Toye, one of the most preeminent historians of Churchill. Churchill, as a self-styled man of destiny, was throughout his political career peculiarly self-conscious of his own rendezvous with history. He was assiduous in establishing his own historic or mythic credentials. So this idea that Churchill's come from nowhere, Churchill would have loved it because it really gave him a platform to big up his own personality. But his detractors also fall into it too by thinking he somehow sort of gazumped the position as Prime Minister when really he did not.
He was the only choice.
He was the only choice. He was handed it constitutionally by the monarch. He had a track record of opposing appeasement. So the faux demain, he definitely was. Although he wouldn't have liked that analogy, he would have thought himself as some sort of heroic deus ex machina, charging onto the scene to fulfill his own destiny and save Britain.
But I think one of the things that's interesting, if we're then thinking about comparison, is thinking about how the opinion and historical opinion develops and shapes and how there are arguments, but we often can't have those arguments about the events as they're going on. So you frame that as he was the only choice, the logical choice, but there are people out there, such as Andrew Roberts, who say that, well, in 1940, to quote, the premiership was theoretically Halifax's for the taking, had he insisted upon it. But as you say, kind of the humility or kind of the difficulties of laws.
Or both.
Yeah, absolutely. But it shows the difficulty, or then brings us to the difficulty of trying to apply that to the comparison to Sri Lanka today. Yeah, absolutely. Or Ranil's specific situation, in that a lot of the discussions that were had around the appointment of Churchill, they come to light a lot later. And then as historians, there's a sifting through that evidence, there's reflection on how that came. We can reflect on, well, was Churchill the only man for the job, the man of the hour? Well, nobody knew that he was going to be the only man for the hour on the 10th of May when he was appointed, or the 13th of May, 3 days later, as we sit from Ranil's appointment. So I guess that's one of the issues that we have, and that we as historians need to be aware of when we're trying to make comparisons between contemporary events and historical events, that the dust hasn't settled. And
I think that leads very nicely into, and drawing it back to Ranil, I wonder, and it is very much a historical wondering because we don't know whether when Ranil made the comparison, whether he was actually saying my situation is the same as Churchill, or whether he sees himself as a Churchill, which I doubt, or whether he was merely trying to rebut a bit of a snarky question from a British journalist
from the BBC.
yeah, and that really does sit well with this notion that you can make a historical comparison, but only when history has then proven whatever to be true, which is at this stage we don't know, because we don't know what is going on in the middle of the Sri Lankan government, or what will happen, and we don't know the mind of Ranil, so we don't know whether he was seeing himself as Churchill or merely getting back at an annoying BBC reporter. Now, if we go on,
sounds like we've really solved it, doesn't it?
Now, if we just draw a little bit of a comparison, or try to, between the contexts of the situations. Now, what the situation that Churchill faced was primarily related to the war, was World War II, and the steamrolling, the blitzing of Europe by the Nazis, and what we have in Sri Lanka is not military in its nature. Obviously, what we have is social and economic and political. The situation in Sri Lanka requires severe and practical economic solutions, and so they're not necessarily the same kind of challenge that either is going to face. What are your thoughts about that? Just in terms of context, situations, challenges.
They're huge, terrible existential threats in their own way, but from a different context, in a different place, involving a different people and a different political system. So I think you're right, chaps. It's very difficult to make comparisons, but we can talk about them. It's just difficult. Our myopia is born out of our proximity to the events here, so it's tough. My personal historiographical hunch is that we don't fall into the bear traps that Churchill himself would have liked us to be walking into, revering his magnificence and his battle against history to become who he was. That's probably all I have to say about it, really.
Yeah, I think it's perhaps instructive for us to look at and reflect on, well, that it's perhaps no coincidence that in both situations we have got a dire situation in which the conventional way of somebody coming to power is different. Were Britain not in the throes of this war, in that situation, well, there's very little likelihood that Churchill would have appeared as Prime Minister. He was very loyal to Chamberlain right up to the very end. It was kind of debating it just a few days before, and he was, as a minister, he was bound to be loyal to the government, and it's the situation that allows a change that is perhaps a departure from the norm. Equally, in the Sri Lanka situation, speaking as a non-expert, I imagine that this isn't perhaps the way in which Ranil Wickremesinghe would have been appointed Prime Minister in any of his previous 5 terms. In fact, you said at the start, this is the first time he's not won an election.
Yeah.
So I think we can certainly say that we can perhaps draw a general conclusion that such situations allow extraordinary appointments, perhaps.
I would say the appointment itself was extraordinary, but the process in Britain was absolutely conventional. I agree with you, without Hitler there probably is no Churchill in power, but just for my money, there is nothing unusual, out of kilter whatsoever, given the past and given the future, with how Churchill was appointed Prime Minister.
But he's supported by the opposition, which is extraordinary.
But not in the 1930s it wasn't, because of a national government, so the precedent, the wind was already blowing in his favour. I would say, before and after, that's a little unusual, notwithstanding the Liberal Democrat and Conservative coalition, but ultimately, in his microcosm, he was being born out of the norm.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting that you say a national government at that time, but those were always in response to what were perceived as huge national crises that required a national...
And those crises had changed from an economic, social one into Nazi scumbags beating down the doors of Europe. Yeah, of course. But I think the way Churchill becomes Prime Minister is completely congruent with established precedent and the Constitution of the UK, albeit he was a rather strange choice. And I'll say it again, or to quote Rob Salem, if there is no Hitler, there really is no Churchill.
Well, what we have here is we have a very clear divergence as far as I'm concerned, because we can look back on history and we can see that there was a national government that supported Churchill, whereas in Ranil Wickremesinghe's case, right now, we don't know whether that's going to be the case. We don't know whether he's merely a political pawn in a bigger game. We don't know whether he's going to be able to solve any of the challenges. In fact, Winston Churchill himself, when he was elected, not when he was elected, when he became the Prime Minister, he mentioned to General Ismay, poor people, they trust me, and I can give them nothing but disaster for quite a long time. And I think, unfortunately, the situation in Sri Lanka is so dire that whomever is in charge, or whichever collective is in charge, the situation is not going to ease up anytime soon.
Yeah, the only benefit we have of Churchill is we can see what happens after, right? We know he did make a coalition stick. We know he did work with Labour politicians like Clement Attlee, and we know ultimately in the 1945 election he was voted out. And whilst he really wasn't happy about it, he took it gracefully in accordance with the Constitution. So we have the benefit of hindsight with Mr. Churchill, not so much with the alternative that you speak about there.
So, shall we leave that there, other than for me to say that I wish all of my friends in Sri Lanka well, and we hope the situation somehow manages to begin resolving itself shortly.
Yeah, absolutely. I've still got a fair few friends in Sri Lanka, so to all of you, I really hope you're well, and keep in touch. It's good to talk.
Okay, so that's that.
Should we give a little flavour of what is upcoming in Versus
exciting.
History World to the
Absolutely.
listeners?
Yeah, let's go for it. So Versus History on Tour, my friends. If you've been following our social media platforms, and there's many of them, every summer when we go wherever we go, usually to the UK because we're quite boring and homebound, and often in Bahrain for most of the year, we go home, we take our Versus History t-shirts and we go to places that we would have gone anyway, pretend we went there especially for history, and we make a little 2-minute ditty or skit about the wonderful things we've seen. So please be a part of that, like and retweet that. And if you want to take part yourself, I think we've still got some t-shirts left over.
Yeah.
You never know, we might order some more and throw them away on social media too. So please be a part of that, like or retweet. We have a good few podcasts coming up. One from the head of history at Felsted, Rakesh Pathak, is coming back for the second time, talking about the future of cricket and what we can learn from the past about its potential future. He's a big advocate, like me, of red ball cricket. That's the longer format of the game, and he's evangelical about that.
No, I'm on Patrick's team for this one. Absolutely.
Anything interesting coming up, Pat?
Yeah, and we've got Damien Lewis later in May, the Sunday Times best-selling author, talking about his new book, American Beauty, which is really, really interesting. That's coming out then. And then involving us all as a team, the Wolfson History Prize have sent us a huge copy of each of the nominees for their 2022 edition. So there'll be some exciting stuff coming from Team Versus History involving the Wolfson History Prize.
We're going to throw some of those books out to the listeners.
Absolutely
Magic.
are, and potentially some schools as well. So keep your ears peeled, my friends. So much to be optimistic about. For us, anyway.
Yes. Now, if you want to follow us on social media, at Versus History, Patrick, you can be found at...
Oh, where can I be found?
At History Chappie.
History Chappie, that's the one, yeah.
And Connell at...
Prohistoric Man.
And me at Dr. Elliot Watson. That's all for me. I wish you well. Good day.
I'll do.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Versus History podcast. Visit us at www.versushistory.com and follow us at Versus History on Twitter and Instagram. You can download all episodes from iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or from wherever you get your podcasts.